Well, as European leaders look to boost their military defenses, the war in Ukraine has already upended years of established military doctrine. Drones have become one of the defining weapons of the conflict, something Ukrainian soldiers say NATO countries are not prepared to handle.
Tanks, trenches, and artillery. The early battles in Russia's invasion of Ukraine played out like scenes from the two world wars. But now, 3 years on, another weapon has come to dominate the battlefield. Drones.
If it had not been for drones, everything would have been a lot worse. Drones are the tool which allow us to give an asymmetrical response when the enemy is larger, stronger, and doesn't value its soldiers' lives.
From unmanned aircraft to tiny homemade models, drones are now the most common weapons in the air and at sea. Ukrainian officials estimate they are responsible for around 60 to 70% of all casualties on the battlefield. Cutting-edge conventional weapons like Germany's Leopard 2 tank have taken a back seat. Even sophisticated air defense systems like the US-supplied HIMARS battery are making less of an impact as hundreds of drones swarm across both sides of the front line. For Ukrainian soldiers on the ground, the reason for this dramatic shift is simple.
It's just elementary mathematics. How much does a missile that shoots down a Shahed drone cost? And how much does a Shahed cost? And how much does it cost to deploy a ship, a plane, and an air defense system to fire at it?
Both Ukraine and Russia are now racing to expand their drone production and adapt to rapid innovations from the other side. Something that Ukrainian soldiers say their Western allies also need to learn.
From what I see and hear, not a single NATO army is ready to resist the cascade of drones now.
As European allies look to ramp up their defense spending, drones are already shaping how the wars of the future will be fought.
Let's get more on this now with Marina Miron. She's with the Defense Studies Department at King's College London, and she joins us from Munich. Tell us, Ukraine has been remarkably adept at scaling up its production of drones. How have they done it, and what lessons can be learned?
Good afternoon. Well, we have to understand that the Ukrainian armed forces had to be very flexible, and we've seen that at the very beginning of the war when both the Ukrainians and the Russians started using DJI Mavic quadcopters. So we are talking about a degree of adaptability here. Of course, there have been government grants for civilian drone producers to switch their production for military purposes, and that is what has happened in Ukraine as part of, for instance, Brave One program. And therefore, the benefit here is that the Ukrainian forces can get prototypes of those drones to test them on the battlefield and can give almost real-time feedback to the producers to adjust the drones, because it is an interplay. The Ukrainians produce new drones, the Russians adapt, they produce new electronic warfare systems or adjust their existing electronic warfare systems to jam the drones. And so you have this cat and mouse game going on, but both sides are kind of trying to lead in this technological race. So there is no point in mass producing drones because they could be redundant just in a couple of weeks.
Now, drones have been used on the battlefield for many years already, also by Western forces long before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. How well is NATO prepared for drone warfare today?
Well, let's clarify for a second. Drones have been used since 1950s, to be more precise, but those drones are different from the drones that are used now. The drones that the United States and NATO has been using are large reconnaissance drones or strike drones, which are very expensive, similar to the Russian Orlan 10 or the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones. What we're seeing now is a shift towards smaller first-person view drones, FPV drones. And this is where the problem is. NATO forces has not experienced the character of war that we're seeing now in Ukraine. And so I think there will be a lot of lessons learned for NATO to adapt to these kinds of tactics, to use these drones for different purposes, as loitering munitions, as well as tactical reconnaissance, and so on. And so new doctrines will probably be written, production will be adjusted, and also training and education of armed forces of respective countries will have to be adjusted to include this training, to include FPV drones and how they will be used on the battlefield. But we should not forget that it's still critical to have the technological edge so that your drones cannot be jammed, and to have enough of them to make some sort of a difference on the operational level. Because still, you see Ukrainians, Russians use drones, but they still use a lot of artillery. So drones do not really serve as a substitute for more conventional weapons.
What do you think that NATO countries should be doing now, Marina, to scale up their drone capacities?
Well, they should be observing both sides specifically, not just in terms of how Ukrainians use drones, but what the Russians are doing in order to counteract the use of drones. And there is a lot of innovation happening on the battlefield, and it's important to study both sides very carefully to see how, for instance, electronic warfare has evolved. Electronic warfare techniques have evolved. Now, the Russians, for instance, started using drones with a fiber optics cable in order to make them unjammable. Same with the Ukrainians. They have taken that idea, copied it as well. And so I think that distilling those lessons will be important, but nothing will probably substitute for real battlefield experience. And unless you're in that situation where you're faced with this threat of drones and you have to defend against drones, of course, simulations, training, I think that will be the key, not so much drone production, because as I said, the drones that are produced today might already be out of date.
Marina, thank you very much for talking with us. That was Marina Miron of King's College London.
Thank you for having me.